Well, I'm going to start off, I'm going to tell a story to start off with, and I think instead Austin will skip the first two slides after all that I made you go through all that trouble of putting on there, so we'll just pass those up. I want to share with you a story that I wrote in a blog, and I just share an abbreviated version of it, that the blog came out yesterday, so I don't know how many of you actually saw it, but it seemed like a good way to open this particular thing this morning, now that I'm having second thoughts as I come up here. And the story was about an experience I had as a child with my uncle. And I've talked many times about my Uncle Mac in here and what an influence he was on me. It was the first job that I ever had as a kid, and it was the first paid job that I actually ever earned an income as. My uncle had caught me one afternoon after school. I had lost my temper. I'd had a very, very bad day. My first girlfriend in my whole life had broken up with me after just one morning together. You know, I mean, I was terribly torn apart. I was just destroyed. My teacher didn't accept my excuse for the homework assignment that I'd forgotten, which was that my brother had accidentally seen it in the bathroom and used it for another purpose. It went down the toilet. We had to get a plumber. My mother, she interrupted me and said, go to the office. So the whole experience was a bad day. My friends were ignoring me. It was one of those kind of days. If you remember Judith Vior's book, Alexander and the No Good, Very Bad, Terrible, Horrible, it was one of those days. And I went home imagining to myself how I was going to enact revenge on the cosmos for its misery that it's caused upon me, for the injury I was experiencing. And I was walking through the house and looking at all the possible objects. When I looked out the back window and out the back of the kitchen, I saw these pots that were sitting on a corner wall of the backyard wall. Now, my mom would do gardening every Saturday, and I saw those clay pots and reasoned that would be something good to enact my revenge. I could easily destroy those pots. It actually became a little bit of a physics experiment for me in reality, because as I turned them upside down, I had noticed that the inside of the pots, the bottom of the pot, is actually thinner than the rest of the pot. I don't know if you've noticed that, but I reasoned there had to be some physics principle that if I hit it just right with a hammer, the bottom would knock out, but the sides would stay intact. So that it became more of a homework assignment, I reasoned. There was a good educational purpose to my anger. And so I got the drawer out of the kitchen, and I got the hammer out of the drawer in the kitchen. I went outside and back, and I began to enact my revenge. I called out the name of Susie. Take that, my girlfriend, and it smashed to pieces. And, of course, the theory didn't work either, because the whole thing came into pieces. Then I went to the next one, and I hit that, and I was going down the line in succession, descending order of size of pot, until I'd gotten down to the last little bitty clay pot. And I had my hand up in the air and was ready to slam it down when I noticed Uncle Mac was looking through the kitchen window. Now, my uncle lived down the street from us, and he worked for himself. It wouldn't be surprising that he was there. It was surprising that he was there at that moment. And I saw him race outside. He looked at me and he said, "Tommy McDermott, what the devil are you doing?" And I answered with that time-honored adolescent answer that covers all sins and excuses and said, "Nothing." To which he moved closer and said, "Why are you doing that?" And then I answered with the other one that's universal among most adolescents and even some adults. And I said, "I don't know." And then to my surprise, instead of coming and doing what you would have expected, because I expected I was busted and he was going to lose it and I was going to get in big trouble, he took the hammer out of my hand, set it down on the table outside, then took the clay pots, pushed them aside, approached me a little frighteningly, I would say, and looked me right in the eye and said, "How would you like to get paid destroying things?" And I looked at him and I said, "Is this a trick question?" He said, "No, how would you like to be paid to destroy things?" Well, I didn't know what he had in mind, but immediately he cleared those pots out of the way, took me by the hand, took me into his pickup, and drove me to his laundromat. He had two laundromats here in Fort Worth. One was on the south side, one was on the east side. He said, "I got all these broken washing machines." You can see the ones that have the tape around them. He said, "I want you to slide in between those rows of washing machines. Wherever there is a tape, that thing is broken. It ain't going to work. I want you to take it apart. Take the hammer, the tools, the pliers, whatever I give you, just start tearing it apart." He said, "It gets a little messy behind there." I was thinking, that's pretty awesome. I'm okay with that. And so my first job was to tear apart these washing machines. He gave me this really interesting instruction. He said, "Take whatever comes off intact, put it in these boxes over here." And he had two boxes to the side, big boxes. One said useful, the other said less useful. He said, "If it doesn't come apart intact, if it comes into pieces, put it in the less useful box." And then he said, "Nothing gets wasted." So I started into my new job. After the first day, he gave me a title, Manager of Large Appliance Reclamation. And I got paid $1.25 an hour, which was more than minimum wage back in those days. And I was having the time of my life. It was the best job. He picked me up 3 afternoons a week, and I would go and I would do this thing, and I would destroy washing machines that no longer worked. And after a while, it became a little bit of pride, kind of a point of pride that I began to try to actually take things apart intact as opposed to just ripping them apart, to where the box that was useful was actually fuller more often than not than the box that was less useful. And after a few weeks, my uncle, as he was driving me home after school, said, "You know, Tommy, you've done pretty good. You've been having fun." I said, "I've been having a blast." He said, "You've earned some money." I said, "I've earned a lot of money." He stopped. He said, "What could you do with that money?" That's all he had to say, because I knew exactly what he meant, even after several weeks. He took us to the garden center, and I took some of that money, and I bought a whole bunch of clay pots. Put them back on the wall that afternoon after school before Mom got home from work. And to be honest with you, I don't know if my mother ever knew about it. She never said a word. Uncle Mac had cleaned up the pots that were broken. By the time I replaced them, I felt sure she would say something. She didn't say anything ever again about it. Now, this idea of pardon, I think, is something that my uncle had taught me a little bit about. I told you last week that hatred is our inability to see connections. That's going to be kind of a key phrase that I want us to keep thinking about as we think about this whole prayer of St. Francis and the idea of being instruments of God's peace. I said hatred is our inability, and then I said sometimes our intentional choice, our choosing to not see the connections, our inability to see the connections. If that's the case for hatred, then I think pardon is simply this. Pardon, let me see if I've got it right here so I can define it exactly right. Yes. If hatred is in fact our inability or refuse to see the connections, pardon is our intentionally creating the space for connections to happen. If hatred is our inability to see the connections or our refusal to see the connections for whatever reason, pain, hurt, we feel justified in our resentment and our bitterness, whatever the reason, choosing our inability, if hatred is not seeing those connections, pardon is the opposite. Pardon is intentionally creating the space for connections to happen. That's what my uncle did. My uncle was always trying to see the big picture and looking for connections. And I think it's what this prayer is more about than simply this idea of forgiveness. The profound example that we saw with Gandhi, this powerful example with the movie Gandhi, where a Hindu man comes to Gandhi who's been fasting for trying to attain peace between the warring communities, the warring ethnic groups in his country. And fasting, I don't remember how many days he is here, but he was dying essentially. And so here comes the Hindu man saying that I don't want your death on my conscience. I'm already going to go to hell because of the murder that I committed against this other family by killing their child. But they killed my child. So an eye for an eye. And Gandhi says, I got a way for you to get out of hell. Raise a child whose parents were killed in this war. But then he throws that twist in there that completely takes everybody by surprise. Make sure he's a Muslim and make sure he's raised as a Muslim. What did Jesus say? You've heard it said, an eye for an eye. But I tell you, love your enemies. It's not easy. There's something bigger that we're missing, of course, when we hold on to our bitterness, when we hold on to our fear, when we hold on to our anger, when we hold on to the stories that we think are who we really are, but these negative stories continue to sort of self-destruct in our lives. There's something bigger than that pardon is about. Intentionally creating a space for connections. If you look up the Latin word, because I love to play with root words, we define things one way. And I was going to show you this wonderful little internet phenomenon that had been happening about the dress. I'll mention it quickly. How many of you know about the dress? Okay, see, even in here, I thought we were enlightened people, but there we are. We're all caught up in the same thing. How many thought it was white and blue, blue and orange, brown and gold? How many thought it was chartreuse, one solid color? So some of you don't know what it's about. You can go back and you can look it up online, just what color is the dress, and you'll find it's had 25 million hits and views on this thing. But here was what was interesting about it. Obviously, the science behind the whole thing was that there's just simply different exposures of light around this dress, depending on how either the lighting or or what you were using to see it, what computer screen, your pixelation, depending on all these other factors, in addition to the way in which our brains perceive color differently, actually, varying degrees. All of those things played into the fact that we see the same thing differently. But I would like to suggest a little bit of an ancillary idea to that, which I don't know that anybody in the whole process of this dialogue even thought to consider, but maybe we don't know as much as we think we know. Period. Maybe our opinions of others, maybe our impression of what's happening across the world, maybe our attitudes towards different ethnic groups or different economic groups or adolescents who lose their temper, maybe our opinions aren't the whole picture. Pardon, when you look up the word pardon, it's not forgiveness. We think of that, and it's gotten used that way, but the word pardon itself actually means wholeness. It actually has two parts, to give and wholeness. And the idea is, if you look at the etymology, dictionary of etymology, it's kind of interesting because it will say that, and it will, of course, give the history of how eventually the early church took that word, and pardon became sort of a way of substitution. It became a way of sort of purchasing or substituting one thing to get rid of another thing. But if you look at the actual root word, it actually suggests that pardoning means giving wholeness, being wholehearted about how we are with one another. This idea of pardon is that we are intentionally creating space for there to be connections. I think it's pretty easy sometimes to get consumed by our injuries. I mean, I've talked to a lot of folks in here. I've got a lot of family members myself. We hold on to stuff, right? Somebody's done something wrong to us, we hang on to it. They say they're sorry. We still have a hard time letting it go. They don't say they're sorry. We're not even going to approach that option. We have a hard time letting go of the experiences we have that are negative. And it's hard to let go of this idea of eye for an eye, of retribution, as opposed to what we can do to create open doors, opportunities for connection, in spite of brokenness, in spite of bitterness, in spite of these things. I remember this quote from Nelson Mandela as he was being freed finally after all the years of imprisonment and all the years of torture and all of this. He was being freed, and he said, as he was approaching the gate, the exit, he said, the first thing I had to do was I had to say goodbye, to let go of my bitterness. Because I knew if I walked out that door with my bitterness, I'd be imprisoned for the rest of my life. I don't know if I've told the little Zen story, but to me, it's almost become a mantra sometimes about the two monks who were walking out one day, and it had been a rainy day, sort of like this, water everywhere, and they were austere. They practiced an austere faith. They were pretty much isolated, stayed to themselves, practiced very rigid rituals and behaviors. And as they were walking along, there was this beautiful woman standing at the edge of this sort of pool of water, and the one monk, without thinking, reached over, embraced her deeply, picked her up and held her tight, and then stepped across the water with his own sandals, and then set her down on the other side, and she gave him a kiss on the cheek. And then he continued walking with the other monk following behind in absolute disgust and disbelief. And after half a day of walking, the other fellow wouldn't even talk to him. Finally, the other fellow just patted him, tapped him against the shoulder. And the first guy turned around and he says, "What is the matter?" And he said, "You picked up that woman. You carried her. You embraced her. You allowed her to kiss you. How can you do that? How could you carry her?" And he says, "I'm not the one that's still carrying her." How easily we carry our beliefs around. We carry even if they're negative beliefs, if they're about ourselves even, we're notorious at that. But especially our beliefs about others. How easily we carry them around as protection when in fact what they truly are doing is maintaining a wall of separation from what is possibly there. From what is possibly there to create wholeness and healing. So how do we get there? I'm just going to share a couple of quick thoughts. And I'm just going to throw them up on the screen because I was afraid I would forget them or not get to them. So let's throw the first one up there. One of my favorite authors, some of you all know Brené Brown. Wonderful psychologist, researcher at the University of Houston. Has got some great stuff on being vulnerable. But I love this quote. "In order for connection to happen, we have to allow ourselves to be seen." She says, to really be seen. Now, I think there's something to that, but I think sometimes it's a little bit of a misnomer. Sometimes I think we kind of get lost with this idea of what does that mean to be really seen, to be ourselves honestly or authentically. And the simplest thing that I come up with when I think about this is I ask myself, what story am I really wanting to be told about me? What story am I wanting to tell? If I'm really honest with myself, when I'm talking to someone else who's experiencing a lot of bitterness, I often say, or if I'm experiencing it, I often say, is that the life that you're wanting? Are you enjoying carrying this hatred, carrying this bitterness, carrying this wall of protection? Is this something you're enjoying? Is it giving you a deep sense of satisfaction? In some cases, in some perverted cases, I suppose that's true. And as my friend Elizabeth Ellis, the wonderful storyteller, once told me, she said, "There was a man who lived once in hell, but he could never get out because he knew the street names too well." It is hard sometimes to let go of the narratives we tell. But I think that's what's part of what Brené Brown is saying. To be truly seen for who we are sometimes means we have to be willing to let go of the stories we tell about ourselves to get to what's really possible. A friend of mine who's in this church, and I'm not going to say who it is. I just protect her anonymity. But some of you all know this woman. Has been a member of this church for a long time. Her husband was killed by accident by a neighborhood boy who was driving down the street. Some of you might even remember this story. Profound, powerful, and sad, tragic story. Her husband, they were both in their 70s at the time, he was already experiencing some degrees of dementia and such. But he had wandered. His hearing was very, very poor, and he had wandered, just kind of walked out past a car, and a boy had been driving down in his pickup, a 17-year-old driving down the street. And her husband at that moment didn't hear the pickup and simply stepped out from behind the car, and the boy hit him and killed him instantly. And he wasn't texting according to all the testimonies. He may have actually just turned for the slightest moment to pick something up or look at something or even to look away. It was only an instant, but it was just that timing. And my friend was saying to Linda and I, she's a good friend of ours, and she was saying, you know, that afternoon after the police, the ambulance and everything was there, she said, I couldn't help but look at the young boy. I couldn't help but see him devastated. And of course she was as well, of course she was. But she looked at that boy. And in her mind immediately she started thinking, what story will he be telling about himself? What story might happen? What story could I tell about all of this? And she wondered if in fact this could easily turn out to lead him into any number of self-destructive behaviors, any number of addictions, never going to college. I mean, she could just see his story just completely going south. It was so obvious. But as she looked at him, she thought to herself, that's not the story I want to tell. That I simply wanted to live with someone saying they're sorry and move on. She said, I need to help empower him. And so she reached out to him and she said, after the next few days, she would go over and she'd say, you know, my husband used to clean out the gutters and my gutters need cleaning out. Can you come over and clean them out? My husband would mow the lawn. Can you mow the lawn? She did all of these different things until she was able to reframe his story, to create a space where he could see possibilities for himself and for how he interpreted what had happened. I think that's what part of this pardon is. Let's put up the next one real quick. Oh, Darth Vader did not say that, by the way. Question our assumptions. By the way, go one more. Question our assumptions. All right, that's O-U-R and not A-R-E. But question our assumptions. I think that is one significant way we can begin to encourage ourselves to practice this openness, is a willingness to simply say, maybe we don't know. Maybe we don't know what was in that kid's mind when he was destroying all those pots. Maybe he's not just a misdirected, maladjusted, destructive child. Maybe there's something else. Maybe this kid isn't irresponsible and carefree and could care less who hit my husband. Maybe there's something else. Maybe not every Muslim in the world is out to kill everyone else. Certainly we can look at our own histories as the first Europeans and think about the fact we all share in evil. We all share in folly. Maybe we could step back and question our assumptions long enough to allow space. And then this other thing, which is one of my favorite quotes, and I'm going to let you just stay with that one. Sell your cleverness, buy bewilderment. Rumi had a great quote, a great idea there. I think if we allow ourselves not just to be open, but to practice a genuine interest in one another, a genuine interest in where we are from moment to moment, a genuine sense of bewilderment. That when we can get rid of our cleverness, how smart we think we are, how much we think we are in control of things, but open ourselves to what's possible and we have no idea, but I can't wait to discover. When we can do that, I think we begin to open the door towards creating what is called pardon, this idea of wholeness and connection. The last thing I want you to just think about here, which is pretty much, I think we all believe this, but it may be something maybe we need to think about, particularly if we feel ourselves burned from time to time. It's not about forgiveness, it's about giving. And recompense, it does feel justified. There are a lot of times when we feel a whole lot better when somebody got their comeuppance. It's never going to be as satisfying as reconnecting. Amen.